Hello and welcome to Where Passion Meets Education, our podcast, which now in episode 4 is moving up step by step to figure out what passion means, what education is. Is it schooling? Is it going to school? Or is it learning from live and lives? And today I have a very interesting live with us. We have with us a gentleman whom I consider as a sage, a guru, a philosopher, one who looks at Eastern mysticism and technology at a meeting point. For him, the Upanishads have the same value as learning from an MIT lab would. For him, technology is fun, but joy is being human. And for him, yoga, for him, AI, and for him, being futuristic has been his fashion and passion. And that's why he's an ideal person to have on our show. A man who ideates, a man who designs, a thinker, a philosopher, a believer. And I would be happy to even say, one who's yaron ka yaar in Hindi. So God bless and let me welcome Sunil Malhotra, the man behind the idea, the man behind the farms, and the man behind YOGAi, the brilliant book in its mystic, lovely, deep yellow, golden yellow cover, which literally won my heart over again and again. By the way, I'm on the second read of his book. So let's meet this mystical man. Thank you, Sunil, for joining us.
You're most welcome, and I should thank you for having me on your show, Sandeep. It's a pleasure seeing you again after quite some time, actually.
Yeah, absolutely, Sunil. I look forward to even more such meetings. And maybe this podcast will go on to a series of conversations wherein we would be able to help the young and the old think alike and maybe make them feel young. So, my opening question to you on the show is very simple. Is design Sunil or is Sunil design?
Well, I don't have an answer to that question. I think I see design as a philosophy and as a tool and as a way of life. And in a sense, I think everybody is a designer because whether we are qualified and educated in design or not, we all do everything that a designer does as far as our own lives are concerned, right? We do problem solving every day. We don't go in with preconceived notions about how a situation will turn out. So one of the great things that I've learned about design is that a true designer actually just immerses himself in a situation without knowing whether he's going to come out of it and waits for things to bubble up. And then the things that bubble up that he or she feels are of value, he experiments with them and goes about it. So in that sense, almost all of us are designers. We design our whole life, right? As soon as we become independent, we become designers. We design our lives, we go forward.
Yeah, Sunil, you said a bubble. What bubbles up? Is it passion?
What bubbles up is passion, but what bubbles up are many, many things. Actually, excuse me, I like to say that we are actually prisoners of our mind. And when you actually bring passion as something that comes from your mind, it no longer remains passion. I think passion needs to come from somewhere within yourself, which I identify as your being, not as your mind. The Western system has actually taught us that the mind is all powerful. And one of the reasons why the world is what it is today is because people have given it that status and then they get carried away by their mind. So I often tell people we are prisoners of our mind. So the day we free ourselves from the mind and use the mind as an instrument and trust our being more than the mind, then you find that true passion actually bubbles up.
You said freeing the mind. Is that education?
Oh, now you brought me into a place which is very interesting, but very challenging because, the word education, in fact, I should talk about a gentleman that I've been influenced by in the recent past, a gentleman called K.B. Jainan, Jinan. He's an engineer and a designer. I think he's been in corporate life as well for some time, and then he just quit everything and went and decided that he wanted uh, to learn from life rather than from a school. And this old gentleman today very proudly calls himself a victim of education. It's worth listening to him. He says, I'm a victim of education because, he says a very powerful statement of his, which I think I will use here with full credit to him. He says the problem is that our education system uses words to educate. And he says what tends to happen is that with words, you become literate. And what you learn is only the world. But the better thing for you to do is to learn from life. I think I'm paraphrasing here, but it's something to that extent. So he says, oh, I'm sorry. He says, words are what they teach. And uh, when you say world, you learn from life. So that's what he says. And he said, I learned that by going to tribals. So one of the things I've said, I think recently you also, amplified it on social media, where I said, where we are today, we need to completely demolish our education system and all its artifacts, including schools and infrastructure and all of that, because teaching is actually the opposite of learning. And what has happened now is it becomes very, very clear that the more you teach, the less people learn.
Yeah. See, now that we are talking about teaching and learning, and we are on track to a larger conversation, which I hope will happen as we go along. So, do you think learning comes before teaching? I'm asking you a very paradoxical question. Do you think learning comes before teaching?
It obviously does, Sandeep. I'll tell you the reason, and this is our own experience, right? I gave an example in a recent talk I did about my book as well, where I said, see, what tends to happen is that we learn. As a 3-year-old, I learned my mother tongue, okay, with all the rules of grammar, and I was able to communicate perfectly without being taught. And then after I've learned the language, you pick me up and put me into school. And I'm taught the same language where I don't understand what I'm being taught, right? So I kind of actually unlearn the language because you started teaching me something. So I think we all learn very much before we are taught. And teaching was invented by the Western world basically to serve the industrial economy. It was all for factories. So if you actually look at the education system that we've inherited, it's all about factories that we are supposed to serve. And it's not surprising that your schools also look like factories, They're in small cubby holes. You're graded like material is graded. You're put into one age group to learn the same thing. That's not the way the real world functions. And I'm happy and we are very fortunate that we've actually stepped out of the industrial age and we've now come to an age where we don't need to be taught, but we can learn much better if we are not taught.
Brilliant. I think that's a sign of optimism. Now, I want to briefly touch upon YOGAi or Kyun Aaye Aap Hamare Paas. So, when you came to my good school recent past, you left behind a lot of thoughts. And we did end up, by the way, encouraging half a dozen young people to actually pick up that book, which I thought was a big achievement for us. And when they read that book, they realize that the Indian philosophy system had all the learning we need. And we got sold out to the Western system of we know it better. Now, where do you put these two things in your perspective of yoga? And how do you reconcile that what you just said, that we are in the age where perhaps we are at good times for learning?
See, this is a loaded thing. I'm not sure I'll be able to do justice to this question that you've asked, but I will try to attempt it, right? Um, if you look at the Upanishads, in fact, if you look at the Vedas, or from the perspective of human philosophy, it is the oldest system in the world, right? Oldest by yards, it is the oldest, and nobody contests it. It has always been an oral tradition. So if you go back, you'll see that teaching through the Upanishads, etc., happened only through an oral tradition of gurus and a gurukul kind of a thing. It wasn't an industrialized situation. The sad thing, when I researched and I kind of intuitively knew about it, but the sad thing about the West, and I'm sorry that I'm being critical here, is that several of these people have actually just read the Upanishads, where they got the copies from, I don't know, some things about the Upanishads, not the Upanishads themselves, and they've made it their own without giving any credit back to the Upanishads. There's several of such Westerners. Of course, to balance that out, in my book, you'll see there are several of the Westerners whom I've been deeply influenced by, because I think they did a great service by going through the scientific method of inquiry and documentation and well-structured research, and they've written books which have made the Upanishads and the knowledge of the Upanishads far more accessible and available to the rest of the world. So here is where we come to an ironical, paradoxical situation, that you've got both kinds of people, but by and large, most of these people, the Western mind wants to actually own. So if you look at, if you look at some of the Swamis that are here today and they're preaching and they're talking about the Upanishads, they are very proud to say that they're not inventing anything new. All they're doing is they're transmitting the knowledge that already exists, which is so rich and people have commented on. They are just transmitters. And in the West, what they would try and do is to simply take a piece of that knowledge, repurpose it for a particular context, claim that they've got it, from wherever they've got it, and try to create an intellectual property, which then they exploit to their own personal benefit. This goes completely against the Upanishadic doctrine, and it goes against the fact that we are all an interconnected whole. So, this is what I think is going to change, tremendously change, and this is what the book journey actually taught me.
So thank you, Sunil. That is actually brilliant. Now to sum it up, as the podcast tries to decode as we go along, does passion meet education? What do you have to say?
So one of the things I would say is, yes, passion does meet education, but I don't like both these words because they've been misused and abused by everybody. So today, passion is like a prime mover for a lot of people. When kids attend interviews, they think it's a great thing to use words like passion and impact without even realizing what passion and impact are about. Similarly, education, like artificial intelligence and all these other labels that we find bandied around these days, they don't have a common meaning, but they're fancy words that you can throw around and look very impressive. So the way I would look at it is that, one doesn't, first of all, passion is not a permanent thing. I have one passion today, and tomorrow, because I grow and evolve, my passion changes. And I always say that both education and passion are things that you should play around with and discover yourself through, rather than use them as two placeholders for you to be able to either get hooked onto or to try and make a living out of. I don't know if
Brilliant. So
that
I
makes
like
sense.
this idea of placeholder. I like this idea of placeholder. So I think we'll leave the placeholder in place, and we will hope that many people will find some place in what we have said. It's actually been interesting, and I wonder when we listen to this or re-listen to this, what we ourselves will take away, because that's what learning is. You take away from what you have said, what you have seen, what you have heard, what you have developed on. So I'm sure that times are good, and like your book categorically says again and again, and like what the experiment we are doing at My Good School, we are simply wanting people to read, as simple as that. And you said such a beautiful thing, that words are the demons in our minds in the learning process. And unfortunately or fortunately, people don't realize that words are the last thing we need to learn. There is a lot more beyond the word. Like you gave a good example of a child, I may summarize here and say that if we have to learn, let's look at the child, let's see the child lives on, and that will be the true learning. Because if you see anything that happens in the world, it happens with a nascent mind. It does not happen with a mind which has got corrupted by dogmas and external influences. So I think on that note, it may be right to say that let things evolve. Let's not push for passion, but let's create, maybe co-create a space where people who have passion can find themselves. Will that be a good way to leave it for education and
Beautiful.
learning?
Yes, beautifully said. I love the way you summed up the whole thing. I might be a little embarrassed listening to those podcasts because I'm not very fond of listening to my own voice. But thank you very much for this. Beautifully said, Sandeep. Great way to wrap up.
Thank you. And I'm sure we will go ahead and meet someday. My little message to all our listeners is that we have just reached episode 4. अभी बहुत आवाजें बाकी हैं. आप जुड़े रहिए हमारे साथ और दिल से दिल मिला के चलते रहिए. यही एक जिंदगी है, यही नजरिया है, और इसलिए हम यहाँ आए हैं क्योंकि हम एक दूसरे से बात कर सकें. वी हैव कम हियर टू हैव कॉन्वर्सेशंस, एंड दैट इज बीइंग ह्यूमन. Thank you, Sunil. All the best in what you do, the ideas you create, the ideation you do, the thought process you champion. Wish you all the best.
Thank you, Sandeep.